Perhaps you listen to this podcast because you're interested in not only becoming a better musician, but you're also thinking to yourself that you would like to become a professional musician in some regard. Perhaps that's full-time or part-time, but you would like to design a musical life that is not only fulfilling, but at the very least, it also contributes to your income. So today's episode is for professional musicians and aspiring professional musicians. We're going to talk about how to design your musical life. Whether you're a self-taught musician, have a teacher, or you're already a professional, this show is meant to help you with knowledge, mindset, craft, and strategies to improve your overall musicianship so that you can become the best musician you can be, regardless of your goals. Welcome to Musicianship Mastery. Hello and welcome to episode number 134. My name is David Lane and it is great to be with you once again. And as I said in the intro, we are talking about how to design your musical life. And again, this could be just information for the dedicated amateur, but more likely this is for those among you who are listening who would like to become a professional musician. You might be in school, you might be in a conservatory studying to become a professional musician, and you might even have a good idea of what you would like to do with your life. But what I like to do for this episode, if I can, is to share a list of things that you might want to consider when you're designing your musical life. Not only paths you might choose, primary, secondary, and maybe more, but also a way to think about going about it. And like, what are the things that you should focus on to develop to become this type of musician, if that is what you choose to focus on. And maybe you are a professional musician already, but you've been thinking about having a change in terms of your focus. Maybe you've been one type of the musician I'm going to be talking about, but you want to become another type of musician and you just don't have that experience. So hopefully this will inspire you. It'll give you some ideas. We're going to go over a lot of material in probably a much too short amount of time to give any one of these much attention. But this is just a big list episode. And again, I hope you will get something out of this. So before we talk about how to design your musical life, we need to know what our menu options are. And in my estimation, there are 4 broad categories that you could choose from. And these sometimes overlap in a way. But those 4 categories are performer, composer, conductor, teacher. Now, you may have already thought of a lot of types of musicians I didn't say, but I think all of them fall in one of those 4 categories. So let me go through my list. And if you think I left something out, I definitely want to encourage you to let me know by going to my website at davidlanemusic.com and sending me a message. Or if you're watching on YouTube, you can certainly comment on this video, or you can tell me with your own voice at speakpipe.com/Musician Toolkit. Again, a periodic reminder, why Musician Toolkit? That is what this podcast was called until we got to episode 101. Okay, so let's talk about that first type of musician, the performer. What kind of paths might you choose in that regard? So first of all, what are we talking about as a performer? It means that you are primarily someone who performs on your instrument. And that instrument could be voice or it could be an external instrument. But your goals as a performer are to develop those skills to the highest that you possibly can, and then find the outlet or outlets that seem to fit you as far as a means of expression. So here are 5 types of performers that I thought of. The first is a featured soloist. Now that could mean that you learn a bunch of concertos on your instrument and that you do your best to become the person who is hired by orchestras to be featured on their concerts that include those concerti. You might also be like a piano soloist, or you might be part of a duo, a trio, a quartet, some small chamber group that much like a rock band, much like a jazz band, wants to appear on concerts where people come to see. Preferably they come and they're willing to pay admission to see you. Now, this episode doesn't really get into how do you make your money. Certainly, if you're a performer, it's not just about paid admission. It's about creating merchandise, selling albums, and a lot of other things. Actually, being a featured soloist might be one of the hardest things on this list because you have to play your instrument at a really high level. And as I already mentioned, you sometimes have to get kind of creative in order to make any kind of a decent income out of that. So the second type of performer is someone who plays in an orchestra, a band, or sings in a chorus. Again, these are all things that you can do on a volunteer basis. There are community bands, community orchestras, community choruses in just about every medium town or above, and sometimes even in small towns. And of course, when it comes to singing, a great many churches also offer an opportunity to sing as well. But these are also things that you can do at a high enough level that you can do these for pay. There are professional ensembles that are always welcoming the chance for very good musicians to audition. Now, for some groups, the level of competition is really intense, but there are ways to get experience in smaller groups while you continue to practice and build up to that point where maybe you can audition for a larger group. A third type of performer is a session musician. This is typically what I would say is someone who is frequently on call by studio producers to come in and record music for either an album, for a film, or for anything that just needs recorded music. This could be like the extra strings or horns that you would hear on like a rock album or a pop album, but it also involves any music that you hear on a film score or a video game score. It's really every bit as demanding as the first two performer positions that I just said, being a featured soloist and being a member of an ensemble, except most likely nobody's ever going to actually see you play. They're going to hear what you did and they'll be able to hear it over and over. But unless they're digging around in the archives or finding some behind-the-scenes footage on YouTube, they're not going to see you perform. The fourth type of performer is for musical theater. I don't post many new episodes to it anymore, but if you want to know all about this category, go find my other podcast, Life in the Pit. That is solely about musicians who either as a hobby or a profession have found work as performers in musical theater. And the fifth category is kind of a wide umbrella, but I call it weddings and social events. So weddings is obvious. This means that you're a musician who is on hire, either as a soloist or part of an ensemble, to play for either the wedding ceremonies, the cocktail hour, or for the reception. Sometimes these are very different types of musicians that do all of these, and then sometimes they overlap. But this can also include other social events, such as banquets, dinners. They're places where you are performing, but you're not really the reason people are there. You are performing music as kind of in a supportive role of some other big event, such as a couple about to get married. But these are your 5 performer buckets, as I like to think of them. So you can be a featured soloist. You can be part of an ensemble, instrumental or vocal. You can be a session musician. You can play for musical theater. And you can play for weddings and other social events. So let's now talk about the second big category, which is that of composer. So just as I started the performer with the bucket of being a featured performer, I'll start with the composer of kind of the bucket of being a featured composer. So that being a composer of concert music. So I think of someone like Philip Glass or John Adams, not the president, but the very good, very famous living composer. These are composers that pop up in orchestral concerts and chamber concerts. And in the world of choral music, you might think of someone like Eric Whitacre. These are big names that you would not recognize first and foremost from films or anything else. You would know them because they get performed live by groups. From a business standpoint, this is maybe the most difficult bucket you can choose. And a lot of it has to do with a supply and demand problem. There are so many composers who compose music really well, and they want to be this type of featured concert music composer. But you've got a double demand problem. You've got performers who aren't always willing to learn something new, and to that matter, not always willing to pay for something new. And then added to that, the audiences who come to listen to performers are not always looking for something new. Now, that's a bit of a stereotype. There are plenty of performers, there are plenty of audience members who are open-minded and they want something new. But it doesn't leave room for nearly a measurable percentage of all the composers who would like to be heard. Another bucket for composers is what I call genre music for other artists. So think about songwriters. This is what Carole King was for quite a while before she did her own solo album. She was known as someone who wrote music that a lot of other groups sang. But whether it's pop, rock, jazz, or whatever genre you choose, you could be someone who's known as a composer for people who perform in those genres, even if you're not performing yourself. The third bucket is one that's a very popular one, especially just in terms of being ambitious for composers wanting to achieve that. Actually, the next two are that. So the next bucket is being a composer of music for film and television, and you could kind of throw streaming into that. So things that people watch as film or television entertainment, writing the score for that. And this is an industry that is constantly changing, and much like a lot of other things, it's not that hard to go get some experience. You can always find someone who's doing a short film or an independent film that would love to collaborate with you as a composer. What's much, much harder to do, kind of comparing it to like being an ensemble musician, is getting the very top gigs, getting those blockbusters that pay really well. And we could have an entire episode about why that is and how that has changed over the years. But that is some place, and there is a lot of middle ground, by the way. There's a lot of places where you can write for film and television. You can earn an income. It's not just the volunteer work you might do with your friend, but it's also not the blockbuster gigs that you might get for the very high-end or high-budget Hollywood films. And kind of related to that is this fourth bucket of being a composer, that is to compose music for video games. This is something I don't know a whole lot about personally, mainly because I haven't played a lot of video games, but I do know a little bit about it, and it's actually where I would say a lot of people who 20 or 30 years ago would have said to themselves, I want to compose music for music and television. A lot of them are pivoting towards video games because whereas film and television opportunities are going down in terms of like high-end work, video games have only been going up. And when you add virtual reality as a medium, and also the fact that your music is a little bit more prominent. In a movie, you are beholden to so many things such as, the dialogue, and most directors are really kind of hoping for the most part that your music doesn't get noticed except for maybe a few places here and there. But in video games, you don't have as much dialogue. It's a little bit more action, and the music is usually expected to stand out a little bit more. So this can be really fun for composers. The one thing that I do know for sure is that it involves a lot of work, like orders of magnitude more music required for a video game than's written for a movie. A lot of it has to do with the fact that the video game can last longer than the movie, but also that it's wall-to-wall music. If you notice the average movie, if it's, say, a 2-hour movie, you might have an hour's worth of score. Sometimes less than that, sometimes a little bit more, but right about half of it will have music. Whereas something like 90 to 95% and sometimes more of a video game is going to have music. So you have more music to do as a percentage. That medium is longer, but also you have to do versions of what happens if someone chooses this door, or chooses that door, or if they don't make the next round. You have to do a lot of what if scenarios built in your music. You have to write it in such a way that it loops in a satisfactory way. But for the right composer, it is a great opportunity. The fifth bucket I'll mention is music for theater. Now you could go ahead and say, well, it's like writing the music for a musical. Or maybe you're writing the whole musical. Maybe you're also a lyricist. Maybe you also write the book, the script, or you collaborate with someone who's a little bit better, more experienced with that type of dramatic writing and understands how it works well in the theater. Or you might do what I have done quite a bit, and that is I arrange other people's songs or sometimes transcribe them to make them bigger than they started out as, but they are for musical theater. They are for new musicals. A sixth bucket for composers is what I would call music for pedagogical publication. That is to say, composing graded music for school choruses, for school bands, for things like marching band, for things like church choir, music for handbells. If you want to know about that, the very first guest that I had on this podcast was with Bruce Tippett. So go scroll all the way back to the beginning, and it's one of the first 4 or 5 episodes. And the seventh and eighth buckets under the composer hat are kind of related. The first one is what I would call arranging. So I kind of mentioned that already for how you might do that for songs for musical theater, which is something that I've done. But you also might be like an arranger for other artists. I talked about composing songs, but you might be the type of person who writes out the string parts. You get a lot of songwriters, maybe they play the guitar or piano really well and they've got a bassist, they've got a drummer, but they don't know how to write well for a string ensemble or to write horn arrangements. So this is something that you can certainly do. You could also be like the staff arranger for someone like theme parks. We recently talked to Doug Meinert about that. That was, I believe, back on episode 127. Totally going off the top of my head there, so I could be wrong about that. And then that last bucket is that of being an orchestrator. So both musical theater and the world of film have dedicated orchestrators, video games as well. Some of them would have a hard time doing them themselves, but most composers are trained enough. They could do their own orchestration, but it's just a matter of time. Orchestration is a skill that you have to really focus on to do it quickly and to do it well at the same time. It is for most people a very time-consuming process to take 2, 3, or 4 staves of music and transform it into parts that every instrument has that will all work with the other parts. And in terms of what type of job is this in terms of being prestigious, well, if you go watch a movie, you will find the composer's name in the main titles at the front of the movie. Or if they don't put the titles until the end, it'll be a featured card. It'll be on its very own frame, basically. It'll say music by or music composed by. To find the orchestrator, you've got to watch the scrolling credits, and you probably have to get about halfway done with them before you get to some music information. It'll tell you who the supervisor was, who the conductor was, and it'll tell you who orchestrated the music. There have been some composers who have gone from one to the other quite well. The 2 that stand out the most are Hugo Friedhofer and Don Davis. Hugo Friedhofer was a well sought after orchestrator in the 1930s. He did most of like the Max Steiner scores, including Gone with the Wind and these other big scores that he did as well. But then in around the mid-40s, he started doing his own films, and he actually won the Oscar for The Best Years of Our Lives in 1946 as the featured composer. And then Don Davis, he used to do music for other composers like James Horner. He was James Horner's orchestrator through most of the 1990s. But then Don Davis had a splash hit as a composer when he scored the music for the Matrix movies. Okay, so that covers the composer hat. Now let's talk about that of being a conductor. So this is a smaller category. When we're talking about being a conductor, we're talking about leading an ensemble. First of all, we can talk about leading a band or an orchestra, and you really have kind of two things you're looking for. You could either be doing this at a school, or you can be doing it for a professional ensemble where all the musicians are paid. So when it comes to school, you could be teaching beginners in like a middle school, in some cases in elementary school. Or you could be teaching early intermediate, such as in high school, or late intermediate to sometimes advanced students in a university. And then, of course, you can conduct professional orchestras of all levels, or bands as well. And you can do all of the things I just said for chorus, although you can also be the conductor or like the music director at a church. And a lot of times, such as in my position, I get the opportunity to conduct chorus, but also handbells. And when I hire musicians for like our upcoming Christmas program, I will also conduct them as well. So that brings us to the fourth and final hat, and that is of a teacher. And let's talk about the 6 buckets I have under that category. So the first is as an independent. This is primarily what I do. And there are various ways you can be an independent teacher. You can be a one-on-one teacher, whether that's online or in person. You can also teach groups of various sizes. The main difference between you and other types of teachers is that you are your own boss. You set your own policies. Now, you might be working under the umbrella of an academy, so they might have policies for you and they might have some rules that you need to follow, but this is one type of teacher you can be. This is what I've been doing for 25 years, among other things, but this has kind of been my primary hat or bucket. You could also teach for either elementary, middle school, or high school. Again, kind of depends on what age and what level of musicians you want to work with. And again, there's some overlap there with a conductor of this very same thing. Third thing is that you could teach at a community college. Now, I've been allowed to do this within the past 11 or 12 years while only having a master's degree. Well, I already know now to get the same job, a lot of community colleges around here desire that you have a doctorate. And that's certainly going to be the case if you choose the next bucket, which is teaching in a university, specifically a conservatory style university where music is taught to music majors. Again, when I was a student, not everybody, and in fact I would say maybe a third of the professors that were at my university had doctorates. And at some point, just about every university I know that teaches music majors, especially if they offer graduate degrees, they require doctorates on all their professors. It's getting harder to find, especially among full-time professors, those who don't have a doctorate. You can be an adjunct or a part-time professor at a lot of places without necessarily needing a doctoral degree. So let me talk about a couple of other buckets that fit under the teacher umbrella or the teacher hat. One is coaching other musicians. And sometimes that's acting as a business coach, or it's just acting to help them be motivated, to help them to achieve their goals. But I can speak as someone who's been on both ends of this. It's a very valuable thing to learn how to coach other musicians and also how to receive that as well. And then the last thing, just to throw this in here, and this is as a teacher, I could have put this under the performer and even the composer as well, and that is content creation. So putting things on YouTube, putting things on a podcast, doing Instagram Reels. I mean, Instagram, TikTok, it's quite amazing. There are some performers and teachers who have built quite an audience have also made a pretty good living just from making content that reaches a lot of people, that people find meaningful. Okay, I've gone over a lot of things that you could choose. That's a lot of menu options. So now let's talk about how do you design your musical life. Here's my advice. It's actually pretty simple advice. But step one is to choose one of these things and go all in. Now again, that's not the only bit of advice, but that is the first bit of advice. You may have heard a lot of things that I mentioned. You may have thought, well, that sounds interesting, and I like to do that. I think I'd like to do that. I think I'd like to do that too. I was the person as a student who said all of that. I wanted to compose, conduct, perform. It's actually, ironically, I wanted to do everything but be a teacher when I was a student. And one of the biggest mistakes I made in my professional life, early in my 20s and really, well, throughout my 20s, was not picking one thing and going all in. So let's elaborate on that. Pick one thing and ignore everything else for now. Pick the one thing that you really want to do and go all in. So take that one thing, set a vision for 2 to 3 years from now, and work backwards. I talked a lot about that in episodes 128 and 132. Having a long-term vision and then setting a staircase of goals. So check out those episodes for how to do that. But this is what you need to do. You need to pick that one thing you want to do. Picture what success looks like for you 2 or 3 years from now, and then figure out what are the steps you need to do to get to that point. It might be a certain amount of music you need to practice or you need to compose. It may involve networking, people you need to meet. It may be experience that you need to get. The next step is to figure out how to build that one thing. So whether we're talking about being a video game composer or whether you're talking about being a session musician as a performer, or maybe you're orchestrating film scores, or maybe you're conducting for high school, figure out what are the things that you need to have as prerequisites, how you can go about that, and give yourself a timeline for building that to become more and more experienced, and practice it like you would hopefully have practiced your instrument before you get to that point. Many hours a day, as many as you can commit to. Okay. Stick with that one thing until you feel like you have built it to 75% of your goal. Like, whether you want to call that, I wouldn't say not your maximum goal, because hopefully the sky's the limit. But like, where do you have to achieve to feel like you've made real success? That this is something where you could say that you've arrived. So let's try to get that to about the 75% mark, where you feel like you're definitely way more than halfway there, but you still have some room to grow. So once you reach that point, you no longer need to go all in with that one thing. At this point, you can slow down on that number one thing, because that last 25% usually takes the longest anyway. Now, this is not to say you could choose to do that one thing. If you have only one thing you want to do really well with music, that is fine. But you could choose to reduce your effort on that one thing and pick a second thing and start doing it the same way. You're still working on the first thing, but not as much. But now you're going all in with that second thing and trying to get it up to the 75% mark. And if you get that there, and hopefully by now the first thing is up to 85, 90%, you can, at that point, if you want, choose a third thing. Now, if you keep taking this approach, you're going to find it's just not enough time to do more than a handful of things. 2 to 3, sometimes 4 is all that most people can do with any degree of aptitude. You're really starting to kind of dabble if you're doing more than that. Not that there's anything wrong with dabbling, but if you're trying to do this as a professional, you want to do as well as you can. So I would really say limit to 2 to 3 things at any one time. So that is a lot of thoughts, but it is far from comprehensive how to design your musical life Again, please share with me your own thoughts, some things you think I missed, or even some questions you might have after this episode. Once again, you can comment on this video, you can send me a message at davidlanemusic.com, or you can tell me with your own voice at speakpipe.com/musician toolkit. That is going to wrap it up for today. If you're watching on YouTube, please hit the like and hit subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll be back with you again next week.